Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Portia Elan about her debut novel, Homebound, an epic story about our deep interconnectedness that spans centuries and features all Jewish characters.
I think there was a part of me that really was very intentional about all of the characters being Jewish, not just because I wanted them to be Jewish, but because I think sometimes the conversations that we can have when we're talking to each other are different than the conversations that we have when we are explaining ourselves.
Portia Elan studied history at Stanford University and earned an MFA from the University of Victoria before returning to California, where she worked as a waitress, bookseller, teacher, and public librarian. She is a former Lambda Literary Fellow and lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her wife and an abundance of cats. Homebound is her debut novel. In this episode, we'll talk with Portia about finding meaning in tikkun olam, both in how we repair the planet and in how we treat each other.
I think that we as humans are very good at making the other, at making strangers out of other people, out of the natural world. And I think our great project as a part of tikkun olam is to make others not other. How do we encounter the stranger and invite them in and make them not a stranger?
And we'll also talk with Portia about her journey to convert to Judaism.
When I was a freshman in college, a friend of mine took me to Friday night services with her. She was like, "Do you want to come?" And I said, "Sure." And I felt very much like I had come home.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to The 5 Books, Portia. I'm so delighted to talk to you. I've been really excited to talk about this one. Before we get anywhere, if you could just give us a brief overview of Homebound.
Of course, I'm so excited to be here. Homebound is my debut novel, and it starts in the 1980s with a young woman who has just lost her beloved uncle to AIDS, and she ends up finishing a computer game that he had started. And that game then echoes 600 years into the future and kind of shapes the destinies and the lives of a scientist and an astronaut and a ship captain and a lonely robot. That's sort of the big picture pitch.
This book totally blew me away. I have been recommending it to everyone I see. I don't typically gravitate towards speculative fiction, and this novel, as you said, moves across multiple timelines. What amazed me was the way that each timeline's plot really illuminates the others and the way they all build towards something that I found quite profound. And then there was this other piece that I really have not encountered before, which was, I think for many of us, especially 5 Books listeners, we've read novels with Jewish characters or books where Judaism sits more in the foreground or more in the background. But Homebound felt entirely different in that the ambient language of the novel was Jewish to me. And the characters happen to be Jewish, but the historical and cultural references and the underpinnings all were also Jewish. And their world is filled with echoes of texts and traditions that I imagine Jewishly knowledgeable readers are reading quite differently. Tell me about that choice.
I mean, I think I approached writing Homebound as wanting to be in conversation with some really big questions that have also driven a lot of my personal Jewish study. Questions around belonging and home and community. Those are questions that I have been seeking answers to, in conversations with my rabbis and in books that I've read and in text study that I've done. And so it felt very natural that that would then show up in the fiction that I was writing. And even the Heschel quote that is the epigraph, like that came at the beginning of writing the book. That was there, like on an index card in front of me as I wrote most of the book.
We're going to get into that a little bit more, but is that where you started? Did you start with the Heschel quote?
It was a kind of collision of the Heschel quote and then a writing exercise that I had done with some friends. And I think the prompt was to write about a character's pet peeves. And I just sat down and Bex, this young woman from the 1980s, was just there. And she is full of prickliness and pet peeves, but also a great deal of vulnerability. And sort of those two things came together, and I was like, okay, this I can follow. This is leading somewhere.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, Surprised by God, by Danya Ruttenberg.
So Surprised by God is a memoir that really, it tracks her whole life, but primarily I would say her sort of young adulthood into her decision to become a rabbi. And she's very definitely Gen X, had a lot of sort of experimentation with philosophy and punk rock and sort of figuring out how to find her place in the world. And the book is very much a conversation with other religious thinkers about how to be a person in the world while also being in touch with one's spirituality and religious identity. I think I was in college when I read it.
So what was your childhood like Jewishly growing up?
So I didn't grow up Jewish. I converted in my 20s. When I was a freshman in college, a friend of mine took me to Friday night services with her. She was like, do you want to come? And I said, sure. And I felt very much like I had come home, even though I had no personal I think I'd been to like a bar mitzvah once in my childhood. I felt very much that I'd come home. And so I started studying with the rabbi at the Hillel and wasn't sure, wanted to study more. And that continued. I lived in quite a few different places and so studied with rabbis in Illinois and in Canada. And then when I came back here to California, started studying with the rabbi who I ended up converting with.
I'm curious, did you grow up within a particular religious tradition?
No. I mean, my parents are sort of nominally Christian. They were raised Christian, but we never went to church. So it was not, I didn't have any kind of a framework necessarily of belonging other than the importance of education. I think that was sort of the religion in my household growing up.
Mm-hmm. And was that spiritual seeking part of your childhood that you can look back and see like, oh, I was looking for something?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've always been looking for like, what is the bigger story that I feel a part of?
What were some of the things that drew you to Judaism overall?
A sense of responsibility to the world, a sense of being in conversation, both with the past, but then also with the present. I think, too, a sense of continuity. As much as there has been conversation and debate and discussion and change, there has also been continuity in being part of a people.
I see so much of those in conversation with, everything you wrote about, and makes perfect sense to me why you chose this book, which really, the book, Surprised by God, the central question there is what it means to choose Judaism rather than just inherit it. And that's very much your story. So how did reading that affect your own understanding for yourself?
It really opened up my understanding, I think, at its core, that like to be Jewish is to be in conversation, that it is not about a particular set of prayers said at a particular time and like that's it. It is about being in conversation. Why do we say the prayers? What have they meant to Jews in the past? What might they mean to Jews in the future? What do they mean to the Jew sitting across the aisle from me that is different than what it means to me? The book is full of quotes. It's like she is in the book in conversation with so many other thinkers. And it also was the first book that introduced me to Buber, and then from Buber to Heschel. And sort of this idea of the internal journey is also a part of a community responsibility. The getting in touch with the self is also about healing of the community as a whole. I think that was a sort of a key aha moment for me. I think that Ruttenberg is really talking about, it's not about just sitting in a room and like meditating or praying and like, I have reached enlightenment. I have reached this good relationship with God. That has to also be connected to everything we're doing outside of that like space where we get to be sort of in our peace or in our, perfect alignment. And that movement between whatever personal peace we find and then like the messiness of being out in the world, like that's a natural part of being a person in the world. Is we don't get to just stay in this pristine spiritual existence. We have to also go out into the world and act on our values.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about spirituality and Heschel, I think one of the things that struck me so much within Homebound was the way that the Jewish rhythms and sense of time were confirmed in science and in the technology. And I was fascinated by the ways that you pulled at that throughout the different timelines and stories. And I wonder if you wanted to just talk a little about what appealed to you about those rhythms and sense of time.
I have read Heschel's The Sabbath many times, and his conception of Shabbat as this sort of palace in time, and that the work of the week is for the sake of the Sabbath and not the rest being to prepare us to work again. And I think that reframing felt so wonderfully healing to me amidst the sort of capitalist noise that we all live inside. And I think it's there in nature, in the sort of seasons. And so I could see it as like a kind of natural rule, this idea of rest as an inherent part of existence. And so that was part of why I included some of the ideas around Shabbat, particularly for Chaya, the robot. I will say, too, that I think ritual and like sort of time-bound ritual that we return to year after year or month after month, season after season, is a way of marking time and like creating memory. If we don't mark the time, if we don't stop and pause and think like, where was I last Passover? Where am I this Passover? Then it all becomes this sort of mass. And so that kind of marking of time by ritual feels important.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, The History of Love by Nicole Krauss.
So History of Love is a story of a teenage girl named Alma who is dealing with the death of her father. It's been many years since he died, but she's still very much grieving and figuring out what his family looked like. And then it's also the story of an older man named Leo Gursky, who in his youth wrote a novel before he escaped Poland and came to the United States. And he is looking for his son, who he has never known. And they intersect in really beautiful ways. And I read it maybe 8 or 9 years ago for the first time.
What struck you about it? What made you choose it as this book?
Oh, see if I can talk about it without crying, because I feel like I love how funny it is. Leo in particular is a very embodied narrator. Quite early in the book, we see him, he's in his 80s, and he is signed up to be a model for an art class. And he is taking Metamucil to try and poo before he goes to this art class. And it's just that, it's just like very funny. It's also sad. But I think there's a great deal of humor in the book and how it sort of plays with being in a body and how that can be kind of an inherently ridiculous thing to be a person. I think I also really admired how much it is a book about the difficulty of being seen and being acknowledged. Leo's novel that he writes is not returned to him when he hopes for it to be returned. And in fact, somebody else takes credit for it. And sort of what do we do when we aren't seen? How does that wound us when we aren't seen? And then what is the power of allowing people to see us?
That's so interesting. It's such a different, I was looking at this choice and I was thinking about memory and, books as vessels of memory. So that's a different take. What about it spoke to you from a Jewish perspective?
I mean, I think there is really a lot about memory and about who passes down stories and the power of authoring stories. Alma, the teenage girl, she's writing a survival guide, how to survive in the woods, I think is what she calls her journal. And it's really just a collection of all of her thoughts and questions and reflections. And that is really one important way of surviving, is to make a record, to say, I was here, I was thinking these things. And I think it is also very much a book about survival. And what does it mean to survive? And that also feels like a Jewish question to me.
Both A History of Love and Homebound are interested in the stories that people carry across distance, as you're saying, across generations and fractured histories. I heard you talk about Ursula K. Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction. So I wondered if you could share that with us in this context.
Sure. So Ursula K. Le Guin talks about that story can be thought of sort of like an arrow or a spear that is like moving to this point and then sort of ending in one place. Or we can think about story as moving through the world and finding lots of little things that we are gathering. And I really am attracted to the idea of a carrier bag as a novel, but also as a way of being in the world. I think that History of Love does that beautifully. It collects a lot of people inside of it. And not all of them find resolution in like a nice, tidy way, which I also really love in a book. I love a little bit of like life is unresolved.
But I think it relates to what you were saying about survival, like the carrier bag or all these little bits that they need to survive. And I see that in Homebound as well. I kept thinking about this idea of story and story carrying forward. And in Homebound, you have the memories of Chaya, this sentient robot. That consciousness is so much about memory and what's carried forward and what we lose. So it just felt to me like the book was about how stories can transport identity across these impossible distances.
Yeah, and so much of what Chaya is like the glue character who carries us from the 21st century to the 26th century. And so their memories then become our only context. Their passing of stories becomes sort of the only record that we as readers get to have of the drowning of the world and sort of the changing of what Earth could look like.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, Cannery Row by John Steinbeck.
Cannery Row is set in Cannery Row, Monterey Bay, California in the 1930s. And it's about sort of this whole community, told much of it in vignettes, but the central action of the book is a group of men, young men who are kind of homeless, decide to give a party for their favorite person in town. And it doesn't go very well the first time. But really, it is about the idea of community as an ecosystem.
And you taught Cannery Row as an English teacher, is that right?
I did. I actually read it for the first time as a sophomore in high school. Did not like it at all. And then came back to it as a teacher when I was teaching ninth grade and really fell in love with the book.
What made you read it differently the second time?
I think when I was a sophomore in high school, had an English teacher who was a little bit more old school, was a little bit more focused on what is the symbol in this and less what is this book trying to say? What is this book trying to argue? Do I agree with it? And so getting to approach it as a teacher and being able to enter into conversation with students about like what are the values that Steinbeck is arguing in this book, and do we agree with them? Do we think that those are good values? Do we think those are values that are true in our own lives? Opened up a lot more meaning in the book for me than I had found when I was 15 years old.
And this idea of an ecosystem, and you write that also in your acknowledgments that you said it rewired your brain, which I loved. Talk to me about ecosystems. It's such an important part of Homebound.
Yeah. So when I think of an ecosystem, I really think of Cannery Row, and I think of the tide pools in Monterey. So those sort of basins that get filled in when the tide is high, and there are all kinds of different creatures in them, and they are sort of supporting different parts of the tide pool. And maybe they sometimes have, I'm going to eat you relationships. And sometimes they might have, I'm going to benefit you relationships. I've given up this shell. You can have it. You can grow into that shell. And so that idea of interconnectedness that does not erase individuality, I think is an important part of what I think of when I think of an ecosystem, that we can be ourselves. We can be different. We can have different needs and fulfill different roles, but we all still belong as a part of it.
And so then can you tell us a little bit about Dr. Tamar Portman, who's the scientist in Homebound, and her study of ecosystems?
Yeah, so Dr. Tamar Portman starts out the book at UC Berkeley studying integrative biology, so basically ecosystems, and looking at how, you know, when one part of an ecosystem is changed, there's a kind of a cascade effect that often humans cannot predict because we don't have that full picture. And her work initially is about how we could potentially use robots or AI to rebalance ecosystems that have been harmed by climate change. And the example that she gives is a real example that happened in Yellowstone, which is when they brought the wolves back to Yellowstone. It meant that the bison moved more regularly. And because the bison moved more regularly, it helped to like stabilize some of the landscape, which then brought back other creatures. So that's sort of the ecosystem connection for her, is she's looking at how do we help that balance come back now that we've whacked it out of balance.
Do you have a science background?
I don't.
No. It was so interesting to me. I loved reading about it. And the other piece is that Tamar Portman, in her letters that she's writing to a friend, she talks about that studying this. She says, I came here because of tikkun olam, which is this idea of repairing the world. Mm-hmm. I thought that was so fascinating. What do you see as the connection between tikkun olam and an ecosystem?
I mean, in a sort of, if we like pull them out, like an ecosystem in balance is the world repaired. And so that is a part of the work, like our work of tikkun olam. And that I think is often interpreted in a more human context. I think it also, though, applies to the broader planet that we're living on, and the repair of the harm that we have done to the planet is part of our responsibility.
I love that. I noticed also you thanked Julie Otsuka and Steinbeck as authors, who you say offer the world a quality of attention that feels akin to grace. What does that attention mean to you in a book?
Otsuka and Steinbeck are both very poetic writers. And in particular, When the Emperor Was Divine is the Otsuka book that I'm thinking of, but The Swimmers has the same qualities. And both are able to really portray the messiness of being human, our imperfections, and then also our capacity for empathy, and do it in a way that does not feel moralistic or judgmental. It is a kind of loving eye that they have given to us to see through. I have Cannery Row next to me, and so I'm thinking particularly of the way that Steinbeck offers us Mac and the boys, who are these men who kind of drive the central plot. They really mess up the first time they try and throw a party for this man, Doc. They like wreck his laboratory. And yet there's no judgment in how they're described. You know, we can see the wheels coming off the bus as it's happening. And Steinbeck doesn't judge them for it, just as he doesn't necessarily come down on the side of like, oh, look at, they're perfect now, when they actually do get the party right. We get to see them in all their mess.
I just want to go back to this idea of community, which you talked about in terms of Cannery Row and throughout Homebound. Have you felt like you've found that community in your own life?
Yes. Not perhaps in like a singular place, but I don't know that we can ever expect a single community to fulfill all of our needs. But I do feel that as I have like moved through my 30s, really found ways to show up in places. And I think that's maybe a key realization that I've had, is that like you have to actually show up in order to have community. Show up not just for other people, but also as yourself. You have to actually be there. And so I think, yes, I have a pretty strong community of I sew, and so fellow sewists. I have writing community. I am now entering my 4th year on the board of the women's group at my synagogue. So like showing up has really changed my sense of like I'm a part of something.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, The Encore by Juliette Izone.
I'm reading The Encore by Juliette Izone, which is a dual timeline about a young woman who is like just starting out her music career in the, I want to say it's like in the early 2000s. And then in 2024, a teenager who has been adopted and who is going to look for her birth mother, who might or might not be a famous rock star. And it's very much about family and our like choices and how choices can lead us to be a family.
Hi, I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. If you're new to the 5 Books, welcome. We're so glad you're here. At the 5 Books, our goal is to be your literary matchmaker, connecting you with the new books you'll love, the essential books you don't want to have missed, and the conversations that expand your understanding of the breadth and richness of Jewish experience. If you're enjoying this conversation with Portia Elan, I want to recommend a few of our past episodes I think you'll like, including conversations with Yael Vanderwouden, Alicia Jo Rabins, and Rabbi Sharon Brous. And if you'd like even more Jewish books between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram at 5bookspod and subscribe to our newsletter. Think of it as your ever-growing TBR pile, that's to be read, delivered straight to your inbox. It's packed with book recommendations and new releases. You can sign up in our show notes or at 5bookspod.org. Thanks so much for being here. I can't wait to help you find your next great read. Book 5, the author's latest book, Homebound by Portia Elan. Okay, now we get to come back to Homebound. I guess I'm just curious, were you thinking of a Jewish reader when you wrote the book, and or have you experienced in talking about the book with different audiences? Do you feel like people are reading it differently?
I definitely did have a Jewish reader in mind. I think there was a part of me that really was very intentional about all of the characters being Jewish, not just because I wanted them to be Jewish, but because I think sometimes the conversations that we can have when we're talking to each other are different than the conversations that we have when we are explaining ourselves to someone who is different. And so to me, that was important to keep all of the characters sort of inside the conversation. I do feel as though non-Jewish readers don't feel like it's a Jewish book, which is interesting. I don't necessarily get many comments from non-Jewish readers about the Jewish aspects, which is fine.
I was curious about that because I've read some of the press and it doesn't seem like the thread that's gotten picked up. And I even wonder if the names, they read so Jewish to me, but I don't even know if they would read as such to another reader.
Yeah, and part of me wonders if non-Jews are less literate in the sort of the non-historical elements of Jewish identity. So like I think that the book has much more engagement with Jewish theology than perhaps Jewish history. And is that not legible to those who are not Jewish?
Was that a conscious thought? I was aware of the fact that so few Jewish books that are written now don't have the Holocaust as subtext. And there was their own apocalypse that they were, all reeling from. And it was those threads of Jewish tradition that stuck and the dirt on the Seder plate. So was that a conscious choice?
Yes. I think because I am a convert and because I'm an adult convert, there is perhaps a historical or a cultural context that I don't necessarily feel fully literate in or equipped to represent in fiction.
You did a beautiful job.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to drill down a little deeper on the Jewish references that we started talking about earlier and hear more about your approach to weaving in Jewish stories and symbols into this fabric of the future. I guess if you could tell us a little bit about the astronaut, which felt to me quite messianic.
Yeah, so the astronaut is Lieutenant California Solo. And she is on this sort of long-range mission to figure out why a generation ship of frozen passengers has stopped responding. It turns out that she ends up having to sort of go on these side quests in order to free the ship from being held in this sort of stasis field. And the side quests are not tests of strength or wit, but really tests of empathy and care.
Did it feel like a messianic story? Was that kind of what was in your head in writing that piece of it?
I don't think overtly, and if it was, I have such a great deal of skepticism about any kind of messianic aspirations.
I guess what I'm trying to say is this idea that there were people kind of calculating the astronaut's return, waiting for the astronaut to return. This question of is it just a story? Is it real? Is it something that's happening? That to me felt like a swirl of a messianic question.
That's interesting. That's not, I guess I wasn't overtly thinking that. And I think perhaps the end of the book betrays my skepticism about the idea that anyone is sort of coming back or coming to save us.
Yeah, which is in itself also a very Jewish idea. Right? So I love that. Yeah. The other piece of that was also the character of Elijah, who there's an Elijah that you get to know in the timeline in the 1980s, and then there's an Elijah who's the guardian of a planet. And again, that felt to me reminiscent of Elijah the prophet, who is already a figure who's associated with thresholds and transitions and waiting. So tell us a little bit about the Elijahs.
So the Elijahs, to me, were kind of a promise. They felt as a name, felt like a promise that you are not alone, is how I thought about the Elijah characters. And that is essentially the function that they serve both for California Solo and then also for Bex in the 1980s. And I really enjoyed some of the folk tales around Elijah's appearance, like when he comes and just sort of like works an ordinary miracle for an ordinary person, not necessarily kingdom-saving miracles, but that ordinary care. That's what I was thinking of when I was thinking of Elijah.
Going back to Steinbeck and that ordinary care. I love that. And so just, again, to ask how you approached the weaving in of these Jewish ideas. What was your thought about how to do that?
I think so much of it was, those were the questions and those were the places I was looking for answers as I was writing the book. I think particularly when I was working on the 26th century and thinking about how to give Jessica, who's the ship captain, a kind of structure to lean against, then particularly I was like overtly thinking about like what are the Jewish structures that I feel like would survive into the 26th century that would feel meaningful enough to still be kind of a foundational part of someone's life and rhythm of their emotional life through different life cycle events. Hence Shabbat, saying the Kaddish, Passover. That was the time I think I thought about it most overtly.
Yeah, I was thinking about it also, even just in terms of, Elijah and this portal, this idea of like, again, going back to tikkun olam and ecosystems, and the portal in the story you describe as a tangle of disharmony. Those are the challenges of like, how do you untangle and create that harmony? That's it. When they go back and complete those challenges, so much of it is about making people feel seen and making people feel that they belong. So I wondered how you view that also when you talk about ecosystems. It seems like it's also applies to compassion and interpersonal relationships.
I think a lot about how what we do every day is how we not only spend our lives, but how we build the world around us. And it's not necessarily built up of like huge moral choices every day in the sort of like obvious, like I'm sitting down and this is obviously a huge moral choice that I'm having to make. And yet all those moments of being present for one another, whether that is sort of in a coffee shop or with our coworkers or with our family at the breakfast table, those are all opportunities to also make a moral choice to be present and to see one another rather than checking out and being consumed with our own narrative or our own worries or our phones. That idea of being present, of acting as witness for others, of being authentically ourselves feels essential in the idea of tikkun olam.
And can you tell us a little bit about how you felt like that related to the character of Chaya, who's a robot who takes on some sentient aspects? And they're also like kind of a chorus. You describe their voice specifically as a chorus, but they do reflect characters back to themselves. What was that about?
Chaya is one of one. They are the only one of the creations like them who has sort of come alive in this way. And I was really interested in having Chaya be literally a mirror, because they can change their face to look like whoever they're talking to, but also really emotionally a mirror, because they provoke difficult feelings in those that they encounter. Maybe not always difficult. I think there are some characters who immediately understand, oh, this is another living being worthy of respect. And I think that we as humans are very good at making the other, at making strangers, out of other people, out of the natural world. And I think our great project as a part of Tikkun Olam is to make others not other. How do we encounter the stranger and invite them in and make them not a stranger?
Yeah, that feels like the first basic rule of Judaism is like you were a stranger in a strange land. So that feels really apt. One image that recurs throughout the book is this image of a rope. I kept like folding it down every time, in the terms of a boat and how the boat operates. And you use it to describe the words of Maimonides and the sages, that they were a rope that kept them safely tethered to history, the way Shabbat kept them tethered to each other and themselves. And then you write in the acknowledgments that you thank Rabbi Chester for sharing this image of the people of a rope. Tell us about a rope.
Yeah, so Rabbi Chester, I studied with him for 4 or 5 years, and he described this image of the Jewish people as, like when you have a rope that's made out of twine, there's no single strand that runs the full length. And yet all of them, all those short pieces, are a part of this extraordinary long rope. And that really stuck with me. I think I also then became very excited about the idea of ropes and lines as the veins and the tendons of a boat, which carries the characters in the 26th century, and those two things coming together, that our connection to the past, our connection to those who have come before, is a powerful force. It is something that delivers essential energy to the work that we are doing now. And so I had a lot of fun playing with the rope imagery.
So many of the characters in Homebound are wrestling with questions of identity. Bex is struggling with her identity, coming out as lesbian, and her uncle's story is shaped by the AIDS crisis. There's a hint of a queer past for her grandmother within the video game. It's, all these different pieces. How do you understand that connection between the search for queer identity and then in the novel's, I guess, broader interest in memory and inheritance and belonging?
I did a report in the 6th grade on the AIDS quilt. For anyone who doesn't know, the AIDS quilt is a art and protest project that invited many folks from different sort of experiences to create a quilt piece commemorating, recognizing, shouting out, memorializing those who were lost to the AIDS crisis. And it was displayed in Washington, D.C. in the 80s and covered an immense amount of space and really changed the cultural conversation that we were having about AIDS. I do not know why I chose this as my topic. This was not a suggested topic. I watched a documentary that had come out in maybe the late 80s or the early 90s about the AIDS quilt. And I wasn't out to myself at that point, but remembered feeling an extraordinary sense of loss, that I think this sort of queer inheritance of loss, the stories that aren't told because of all those who were lost in the AIDS generation. And that reaches even farther back, the stories that weren't told because it wasn't safe, because we couldn't be open. And so to me, having Beck sort of come to this self-acceptance by the end of the story really felt like naming and recognizing that in order for us to have queer history, we have to have queer people who are here. And the nod to the grandmother potentially is like another echo of like, what are the stories that aren't told? The friendships that were more than friendships that we don't talk about in language that names them truly.
I found it so moving the way that those stories were part of, within the video game, of the challenges of like, how do you go back and create harmony? How do you fix things? And part of the fixing things is again, making those people feel seen. I found that really so moving. What feels most meaningful to you about your Jewish identity right now?
I think right now it feels like the relationships I have with my elders, both through the women's group and then like this Friday, the queer group is like doing a Shabbat takeover, basically. Like we've rewritten some of the prayers. And I would say that if you take me out of the equation, the average age of this queer Shabbat group is like 65 or 70. And so I feel just very like honored and grateful to be in community with elders. That's what feels like most powerful to me right now.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for sharing all of this with us. Again, it was really just one of the most original books I've read in such a long time. And every time I thought I understood where you were going and how another thread connected, something else surfaced for me. And I just was scribbling notes the whole time. I think it's definitely the kind of novel that is sticking with me and I think will stay with me for a long time. So to our listeners, if you haven't yet read Homebound, I hope you'll read it and come back and listen to this again after you've read it and understand it a different way a second time around. But thank you so much for being here, Portia.
Thank you so much for having me. And I loved hearing like what you've added to the text in your reading.
such a Jewish text.
Yes.
That's what they're for, right? It's for adding our own commentaries. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us for the 5 Books. Our guest today was Portia Elan talking about her book, Homebound. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love to hear all about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or to our email, team@5bookspod.org. We also have a newsletter. We'll send you an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed and even more book recommendations. You can sign up for the newsletter in our show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Alad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to New Reads, the Jewish Book Council, and thank you to Felicia Herman and David Benor.